President Trump says that the US plans to run Venezuela. I wonder what you expect that will actually mean in practice. Will there have to be American boots and administrators on the ground?
I don't think even Donald Trump knows what that means. And clearly, if you looked at the news shows yesterday on Sunday, Marco Rubio doesn't seem to know either. Marco Rubio is claiming they're just going to monitor the flow of sanctioned Venezuelan oil in and out of the country. That is possible, but it's certainly not the control that Donald Trump seemed to allude to when he spoke on Saturday night UK time. Again, I think right now what he's thinking about is the U.S. is just simply going to administer some form of protocol for international investment in the oil sector, primarily, obviously, favoring U.S. companies. We don't even know if he's imagining any sort of scenarios where other oil companies that are already active in Venezuela, such as Repsol, Eni in Italy, or Marelli Prom, or Shell, will be allowed in under Trump's new vision of U.S. control over Venezuela. But I think it's not going to extend much more than that. I don't think you'll see boots on the ground, maybe in key infrastructure areas, maybe in key areas where oil companies want to invest, maybe in key areas where, if, for example, there is an attempt to invest in gold mining. There's a lot of illegal gold mining that occurs right now in the Orinoco Valley of Venezuela. That could happen there. But we're not looking at an invasion force or an expeditionary force or even a sort of a peacekeeping force. We're looking at probably quite likely a targeted U.S. military presence in key areas of the economy to help facilitate U.S. intervention.
Yeah, in maybe investments, a sort of mercantilist approach, maybe, I think, yes, understood. In your view, is there any legal justification for President Trump's actions in Venezuela? Because that's the other major sort of precedent that may be set here.
There really is no legal precedent. The closest thing would have been Panama in 1989, 1990. But in that case, it was different, first of all, because it happened on the heels of a stolen election. There had been a military coup. There was some effort to consult regional neighbors to advise on that by then President George H.W. Bush. This is a case where there was a buildup. There was no actual invasion force. It wasn't even a clear narrative about what this was supposed to do. We heard it start out about narcotics trafficking and narco-terrorism, and then even before that about immigration, and then about removing Maduro. Even the narrative for the American people, for the international community has varied. So no, there's no legal precedent here. It's a very dangerous precedent. Today, the UN Security Council will be meeting. They'll be talking about this. I suspect many will be condemning it. This is really a violation of national sovereignty. We can make the case that this was in favor of popular sovereignty, that's what the case that many in the Democratic opposition were trying to make, that actually since Maduro lost the election in July 2024, that popular sovereignty had been violated and this was a legitimate intervention. The truth is they didn't actually take the opposition and put them in power. What they did was just effectively decapitate the Maduro government by removing Maduro and the first lady, and then putting in place the first vice president, Delcy Rodríguez. So this isn't even regime change or an affirmation of popular sovereignty. This is out an invasion and leadership change forced by the United States without any sort of international support or sanctioning.
Well, Christopher, while we're talking history, do you think that the White House has learned the lesson of Iraq? Can it pull this off? Are there any chances that this could be a long-term policy success for President Trump?
I think Trump has learned one lesson from Iraq, which is don't commit troops fully. Don't overpromise as you can rebuild the country. But in other ways, he's going down exactly the same road. We've heard him refer to the oil wealth as being a possible way to generate or even make this effort pay for itself. We've seen him talk about how with the rich oil fields, Venezuela can be rebuilt. The problem is, and this was the case in Iraq too, you're looking at, basically in the case of Venezuela, more than 2 decades of an autocratic, corrupt regime that's engaged in all sorts of illicit activities, from narcotics trafficking to illicit gold mining, to human trafficking, to money laundering. You don't basically completely rebuild a state by decapitating its leader, effectively or figuratively speaking. And oil is not sufficient to basically rebuild an entire system of justice and the rule of law in the country. Oil investment goes in, it's very localized, it's very specific. They really do not care much about the broader judicial system or the broader state capacity that really is at the root of this problem.
There has been little reaction from the EU, a statement from Kaja Kallas over the weekend. Other than that, quite little. How should Europe be thinking and responding? I mean, the main response also seems to be the concern around Greenland from Denmark. What is the reaction in Europe?
So going first to the Greenland issue, that really stems out of the deputy chief staff to Donald Trump. His wife posted a picture of the U.S. flag superimposed on Greenland, indicating that Greenland would be next. At best, an immature move, certainly a controversial one, probably not even realistic. So yes, there is concern in Denmark. Generally speaking, Europe, having spoken to European diplomats during this whole 6-month buildup, quite frankly, they didn't know what to do. I remember one diplomat, I can't name where, in a continental foreign ministry, who said basically, this is like watching a train wreck. There's no space for us to get involved. We can't seem to broker any sort of deal. So what you've seen is several things. First of all, a certain reluctance for them to denounce it, given, if you will, sort of Trump's intemperance and thin skin. But you're beginning to see some caution build. The Prime Minister of Spain, Sanchez, did basically condemn the invasion. We see Keir Starmer in the UK start to walk it back and say very clearly the UK was not involved. Quite frankly, the Europeans don't want to own this. But on the other hand, they don't want to stick their heads too far above the parapet. For the primary reason is there is European oil investment in Venezuela. Some of those contracts have been suspended. As I mentioned, Repsol and Prom and Eni. The truth is they want to get their nose back under the tent in Venezuela. So they're lying low, unfortunately. And quite frankly, there's a real role for them to play in this. I mean, they could try to steer a serious debate about the role of international norms and international law and how the U.S. abuse them and the implications for other countries that may be trying to do the same, say China and Taiwan or Russia and its near abroad. So there's a space for the EU right now. I think they're just waiting and trying not to offend Donald Trump.
Well, yes, you mentioned China and Russia. To what extent do you think that Trump's actions in Venezuela will actually embolden them? For example, China on Taiwan.
I think China has always had its designs on Taiwan. We know that. This may just accelerate those plans. I think, quite frankly, it can make the case now. And it's unfortunate, sort of this whataboutism. Well, if they were to invade Taiwan or even threaten Taiwan, it can fall back and they will think, well, look what you did in Venezuela. The same with Putin and the near abroad, whether it's Moldova, Romania, obviously Ukraine as well. Yes, I think this does embolden them. It basically sort of throws us back to the world of spheres of influence. Trump is claiming, even explicitly, that since Venezuela is in the U.S. sphere of influence, its hemisphere, and he talks proudly about the Monroe Doctrine, or now it's called the Donroe Doctrine, as sort of a manifestation of U.S.'s power and its ability and right to project itself in its own sphere of influence. That's very much the argument that Beijing and Moscow have been using in their own regions. I think, quite frankly, this seems to signal that it's open season. Whether they'll act immediately, I don't think. But I think this is where it becomes important for more, let's say, responsible, more internationally norm-abiding countries in Europe and elsewhere to stand up and say, we condemn this, and we also condemn other examples in other regions as well, should they occur.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that you mentioned the Monroe Doctrine. Obviously, James Monroe, this was originally around Latin America, basically the US declaring that it was going to be closed to other powers. It dates back to 1823. And I think it's an interesting point, though, about whether President Trump is actually limiting the US to just the sphere of influence, which would be North America and Latin America, or whether it goes beyond that. And to that point, Greenland, I mentioned it briefly. I wonder whether you could elaborate on, I mean, Greenland is in mass, an enormous place with huge resources, but the population is tiny versus Venezuela. Is Greenland next? A lot of people are asking that.
I think it would be completely unprecedented for the U.S. to attack a European ally, especially. What's amazing about all this, by the way, is the way Trump just baldly asserts the intentions of all these interventions being about natural resources and U.S. access to them and U.S. companies' access to them, which is deeply problematic. It feeds into this narrative of U.S. imperialism that's always been present clearly in Latin America, but now also elsewhere. In the case of other countries in the hemisphere, Donald Trump is now beginning to call out other countries. He's talked about Cuba may fall. There may even, Marco Rubio talked about maybe even there'll be use of military force in Cuba. He's talked about the fentanyl and cocaine trade that's crossing Mexico into the United States, and there may be strikes there. He's also threatened Gustavo Petro, the president of Colombia, citing the production of cocaine in his country. This is clearly, he's trying to signal that anything can happen. It's a lot of bluster. It's a lot of chest thumping. But I think quite clearly what he's trying to do is intimidate other countries to yield to his demands, which gets us back to Greenland. I don't think he's going to invade Greenland. I think this is Donald Trump's strategy. It has been since he was a real estate magnate, which is to sort of make extreme demands and then try to negotiate them back a little bit to get what you want. So it's impossible to think, but who knew? Who knows? I thought it was impossible that they would seize Maduro, but it's impossible to believe they would invade Greenland. But I do think what he truly is serious about is some U.S. presence in Greenland and also access to its natural resources.